Welcome to the ITIL Overview course. The intent of this presentation is to give you an understanding of the basics of IT Service Management, and in particular as described by ITIL. So we'll look at the detail in a moment, but before we start, let's just run through an agenda on slide 2. What we're going to be covering is the key definitions associated with ITIL. ITIL has its own language, and one of the important things associated with ITIL is to get a commonality of language which develops a commonality of understanding, so that when you're talking to colleagues or suppliers or customers, we all know the difference between, for instance, an incident, a service request and a problem. Then we'll cover a brief history of ITIL. It's been around quite some time, it's been in various guises, but we'll look at the background to ITIL and how it came to be what it is today. A key aspect of ITIL and service management is what capabilities and benefits it can provide for an organisation. So we'll look in some detail at those areas as well. Now, ITIL is based around the service lifecycle, and so one of the things we do want to look at is what the service lifecycle constitutes, the component elements of it and how they work together. A core element within the service lifecycle is what ITIL calls the processes, and so we'll look at the generic elements of processes and what putting a process under control means and how we measure process maturity. Following that, we'll look at the key ITIL roles. Roles is another core aspect of ITIL, and we'll look at those roles, after which we'll look at the key ITIL processes. Now, there's a total of 26 processes in ITIL. We're going to be touching on those, but looking in a little bit more detail at 13 of those, the 13 that are most relevant to most organisations. And then we'll wrap up by putting this all together and briefly looking at the rights and wrongs of adopting an ITIL programme. Let's start then with some definitions. So we've talked about service management. What does service management mean? The definition of service management is a set of specialised organisational capabilities that provide value to customers in the form of services. We don't need to know the details of those capabilities, but for reference they represent our organisation, our management, our processes, our knowledge and our people. And it's our ability to put those together in order to deliver services that provide value to customers. The definition of a service is a means of delivering value to customers by facilitating outcomes that customers want to achieve without the ownership of the costs and the risks. In other words, our customers, be they internal, i.e. our departments, our business users, or if we're a managed service provider, our end users, the people we're contracted to provide a service to, our objective is to deliver value that supports their business activities on their behalf. In other words, they've entrusted us as their IT service provider to deliver those services. And ITIL itself is one of at least 2 service management frameworks that we've mentioned before is based around the life cycle of a service. More on that in a moment. 3 more definitions, and these are the basic building blocks in ITIL. So we've mentioned processes, and a process, and this is plain English, is a structured set of activities designed to accomplish a specific objective. These activities could be many and various. A process, for instance, that's not an ITIL process is the process of taking on a new starter or managing a lever. In ITIL terms, a process could be things like incident management, the management of incidents, change management, the management of changes. But it's simply a set of activities. The function in ITIL terms is a self-contained unit of organisation. This could be an individual, it could be a team, it could be a whole department, but it's essentially the people together with any other tools or resources they need in order to carry out one or more processes or activities. If, as an example, we take the obvious function being the service desk. The service desk contains obviously people, but to be a function it needs to be self-contained, and therefore the other facilities a service desk needs to be self-contained would be a form of communication with the users it's supporting, a tool set to be able to log the calls that they're receiving, some kind of facility to manage those calls or expertise, and then at the risk of being facetious, they can't survive without coffee and breaks and so on. So it's the entire components that an organisational unit needs to be able to carry out one or more activities. The roles exist within a process or a function. There's some specific roles that we'll talk about in a little while, but a role in a process, for instance, would be a process manager or a process owner. A role in a function, again referring to the service desk, could be the service desk manager or the service desk analyst. What is important about these processes and functions in particular is they're a little bit like oil and water. They don't mix. The process is the activities, the functions are the people or teams that carry out those activities. And I'll explain a little bit more about this in a moment, but if we take an example, the service desk, being a function, undertakes a number of processes or touches a number of processes. These include, as we've said, incident management, because users call about issues, problems, incidents that arise. It includes change management potentially, because they're taking requests for change and logging those and passing them to the relevant part of the organisation. It includes event management, because they're monitoring what's going on in the organisation and in the infrastructure. And yet, the service desk is not the only function that's undertaking elements of those processes. So if we take incident management as our example, the service desk represents first line incident management. In other words, they're the first point of contact, the single point of contact for users to get in touch about incidents. But whilst the service desk will attempt to fix or resolve the incident at the first point of contact, that's not always possible. Therefore, they'll log it and they'll assign it to what's referred to as a second line resolver group, who will then undertake further analysis, and if they can't fix it, assign it to a third line or potentially third party resolver team. So what we have in essence is each process is undertaken by one or more functions, and each function undertakes one or more processes. So it's a many-to-many relationship. Looking now at the background to ITIL and providing a brief history overview, if you like, it's existed for more than 40 years now, and in its initial form it was referred to as GITIM, which stood for the Government Information Technology Infrastructure Management, and was established by the UK government, owned by the Office of Government Commerce, and the intent was to understand and document and therefore be able to reuse what was considered best practice in the management and delivery of IT services. In the initial days, this was established by looking at what worked well and then documenting it in two key government departments, Customs and Excise and Inland Revenue, now known of course as HMRC. And the original authors of GITIM, now ITIL, were working in those departments and documenting, as I said, what worked well. And then in 1989, GITIM became ITIL, which at the time stood for the Information Technology Infrastructure Library. It now officially doesn't stand for anything, it's simply ITIL. And in a similar way to BHS, as was, British Home Stores became BHS. But it came out in version 1 in 1989 as a set of 10 books. The major update was in 2007 when it became version 3, and that's the point at which ITIL was structured around what we now know as the service lifecycle. There was a refresh or an update in 2011, which then became known as the version 3 2011 edition. But as of, I think it's 2015, ITIL is no longer officially editioned or versioned. It's just known as ITIL, much in the way as Windows is now Windows, not Windows 10. What's important to understand is what ITIL, or generically service management, can deliver for an organisation. Why would we use it? Because what we'll see in a little while is you don't have to use it. You can work reasonably adequately without ever having heard of service management or ITIL. So why should we use it? Well, at a broad level, there's a number of reasons, some key benefits, capabilities and benefits. In terms of capabilities, it can support business outcomes. The primary focus of ITIL as a service management framework that IT adopts is to underpin business activities. That's a core theme that runs through ITIL. And the ITIL processes underpin the business processes, the IT activities underpin the business activities. This helps bring those two together. It can enable business change. If there's one constant, it's change. Typically, the business wants more change than the service provider is comfortable with, but we have to find a way of managing an appropriate level of change without causing issues and downtime. Risk is always present, and so one of the challenges ITIL faces is to manage risk in an appropriate way. We're not going to prevent all risks occurring, and nor should we attempt to do so. It would be too expensive. But we need to be aware of what the risks are, what the risks in an IT world are, and the impact of those on the business world, and at least be aware of them and manage them appropriately. The customer experience is the next capability that ITIL gives us, and that is that although IT is essentially a technical activity, the benefit for the customer is the outcomes from IT, and their experience of using IT is an important aspect of their judgment, their value assessment of IT. Equally valuable, of course, is that the community, the business community, get value for money from their IT service provider. Again, be this an in-house or an external service provision, value for money is always important. And finally, we want to adopt a process of continual improvement. The world doesn't stand still, we have to move with it. The business doesn't stand still, IT has to move with it. And so this focus on continual improvement is in fact an entire one of the 5 life cycle stages. So, having looked at ITIL's capabilities, let's look at how they translate into the benefits for an organisation. We've talked about the ability to manage risk, and clearly that's a benefit for the organisation because risk itself is an undesirable concept that can disrupt business services and customer service, so the ability to manage risk is clearly a benefit. There is always the potential for service disruption, and one of the main benefits of ITIL is that we do things in a consistent, predictable and reliable way that prevents things going wrong. So we're looking not just to manage incidents but to prevent them occurring and the consequent disruption. We want to be able to demonstrate the value that IT provides to the business. A little while ago it occurred to me in an organisation I was working for that potentially the average person in IT might cost the IT department and the company some £50,000 a year. Many companies would be challenged to make a 10% margin on their business turnover, but were they to do so, then the cost of employing an IT person, in other words, how much of whatever it is they do they'd have to sell, if 10% of the margin covered the costs, there'd have to be £500,000 worth of sales to support that one IT person. Reversing that round, what is that IT person doing to support the generation of that business turnover? And if you can't answer that, then the challenge is how do we answer the value that IT adds to the business operation? So this is one of the areas that we're very keen to promote and show how IT adds value. We talked about adding value for money, and so one of the challenges that IT has is to demonstrate that the business gets value from its IT service provider. It maximises the return on investment that it's put into IT, and it gets better value from its IT service provider than it could if it went elsewhere, i.e. external or outsourced. The supply chain itself comprises not just the IT service provider and the customer, but there are external suppliers or service providers that are providing services in concert with the IT service provider. And so one of the key aspects of ITIL and service management is that we have to manage across that entire supply chain and therefore manage our suppliers and ensure that what they provide us is consistent with what our customers need from us and what we're providing in that respect. In terms of marketing and consumption of our services, it's not sufficient these days just to deliver a service. We've got to demonstrate that that service is adding value, understand the relationship between the IT processes and the business processes, and demonstrate how we're adding value to the operation. So there's an element of marketing in that and relationship management that we'll look at in a little bit more detail later. A key aspect and a key benefit, if it's got right, is that what IT delivers is what the customers require of it. And there's an entire process called service level management that's devoted to ensuring that we understand what our customers need from us and that our focus remains on delivering what they need at the service levels they require to meet their expectations and requirements. Clearly, the services need to be not simply available, but available to the people who need them as and when they need them and as and where they want to consume them. And in this digital age, many customers, many end users are on the move, and so we need to make sure we can provide services wherever and whenever they're required. We want to protect the business from risk. We want to avoid service disruption, but where it occurs, our challenge is to minimise that disruption and deal with it as quickly as possible and ensure normal service is resumed. We want to be able to understand and manage our budgets and our financial planning, both within IT and of course within the business. We often find that the IT budget represents 5% or more of a company's entire budget, which is not insignificant, and therefore that needs to be managed and focused on in terms of ensuring that we deliver an efficient service as well as an effective service. We mentioned change. Change introduces risk, and therefore one of the benefits is that we can adopt the rate of change or close to it that the business requires without the unintended side effects and consequences of change, namely disruption and outages. And of course, all the time we want to maintain good relationships with our customers, improve their satisfaction with the services we provide. Firstly, because that's an effective way of providing a service, we want to be able to do that. Secondly, as an internal service provider, we're conscious that we need to guard against the risk that the organisation might take a decision to outsource its services. And so implicitly we're in competition with the outsourcers, and the most effective way of dealing with that is to maintain effective services and good customer satisfaction. It's worth now looking at three perspectives from a service management point of view. The business is consuming the IT services. What do they want from their IT service provider? We mentioned this earlier: consistent, predictable and reliable services. They want to know when they turn their laptop on, it's going to work. When they try and sign on to the application, it's going to be there. When they submit a transaction, the system's going to respond. And they want that ideally 100% of the time, wherever and whenever they need to use it. They want those services at lowest cost, because ultimately they're an overhead to the business costs. They want those services to be secure. We're in an age where we're continually bombarded with cyber attacks. So a key aspect of ITIL and a key risk to manage is unwanted intrusion and the consequential impacts of that. They want IT to be more responsive when the business wants to make a change, when the business wants to make an improvement, when it wants to do something different. It wants IT to be able to respond fairly quickly. So our ability to respond to that is a key attribute of the service we provide. The business wants confidence that IT understands its perspective and is going to be focused on delivering against it. They'd like IT not just to provide the services, but to proactively look at ways of improving those, not necessarily wait for the business to say this is becoming redundant or inefficient. We should promote the good use of IT. IT has two objectives. One is to keep the lights on. We tend to be very good at that, but the other that we're not so good at is helping the business make the most effective use of IT services. And one way of doing that is to preempt and predict how things are going to change, look at what technology is going to be available, and proactively help the organisation understand and get benefit from those. Communication is almost impossible to understate the value. In the 1980s, when IT incorporated the network teams, it became known as ICT, with the C standing for communication. I always think it's a great pity that we dropped the C again and went back to IT, because it's the C bit that we're not very good at. And I've got some examples of that we'll talk about later. But essentially, it's maintaining communication, keeping people informed, keeping them up to date. There's nothing worse than a service provider who keeps you in the dark. And interfaces between applications, between IT and business processes is a constant challenge, and having a framework for managing those will deliver business benefit. So that's looking at it from a business perspective. Let's look at it now from the perspective of the IT service provider. As a service provider, there's nothing better you can get than a clear definition of what services your customer needs and what level of service they require. This goes back to service level management, the main output from which is the service level agreement that intends to document those requirements. Having that clear definition basically then defines everything that IT should do, i.e. everything we should do should be focused on meeting the service levels and delivering the services that the business expects and requires. Using ITIL is proven good practice. Our understanding is that something like 85% of UK organisations are using ITIL as their service management framework. It's also extensively used in North America, in Australia, and of course throughout most of Europe. So over the years, and as you can see from the history that we looked at, it's developed into a very solid good practice framework. And so adopting it and aligning to it is by definition a good thing to do. One of the great benefits of ITIL is that it moves us as a service provider from being essentially reactive to being proactive. We've talked about that from the business perspective. What I mean by that, as a for instance, is we all know that it's better to get something right first time than it is to put it right after it's broken. Years ago I used to work for Philips, and we produced television tubes and television sets. And we'd build the components into a TV set, and at the end of the production line we'd turn it on, and if it worked we sent it to one of the retailers. If it didn't work we'd either throw it away or fix it. That's a bonkers way of working. The focus these days in all assembly lines and production facilities is that we test the components before we assemble them, and we test every sub-assembly as we put it together. There's a number of processes that we'll look at in ITIL that have that proactive element to them. In fact, all of them do, with the exception of incident management to one extent or another. And it's a universal truth that when we adopt the proactive aspect of those processes, we will be doing a better job and a more cost-effective job. We will be more efficient in the way we operate. We will generate a lower error rate. When we talked about consistent, predictable, reliable services, that's essentially what we mean. Things work when they're turned on. One of the challenges IT has is to capture and reuse management information, data, etc. And so one of our challenges is to capture that and use it to support better decision making. So that's from the IT perspective. And if we now look at the IT functions, or the staff or the people who work within IT, what's the benefit for them? Well, it's a technology environment, and many of the people who work in IT are technologists and they understand the technical aspects. But ultimately, they're there as a means to an end. The technology is not an end in itself, it's a means to an end. And it generally works better for people if they understand how that technology supports the activities of the business and the business processes. And that understanding makes life more satisfying if you understand what part you play in the delivery of the ultimate business services. It gives you a greater sense of purpose as a result, because it gives you that perspective. And that in turn can be more motivating, There will always be technicians who simply want to sit behind a computer screen and program, but on the whole, having an understanding of how this fits into the bigger picture gives you a better perspective. That in turn can give you better job satisfaction. And then associated with ITIL, there's a range of exams and qualifications that can be achieved or attained that can help you move your career forward. Another of the challenges in ITIL that we try and deal with is the potential for misunderstanding. And many of you might recognise this slide. I've seen it since the 1970s. It's a classic way of describing the misconceptions that can arise with, for instance, an incomplete or ambiguous specification. So you can see some of these amusing consequences. I particularly like the bottom left one, how the project was documented, i.e. it wasn't zero. But classically it shows ultimately that what the customer actually needed was not necessarily what was delivered. And this typically occurs because there's multiplicity of people and processes involved in getting from the original specification to the finished article, and unless that's tightly controlled, then what's going to be delivered isn't necessarily going to meet the original specification.